What if I told you that the man who would preach to over 100 million people started as a failure? What if the greatest evangelist of the 19th century was once rejected from church membership because he knew too little about the Bible? His name was Dwight Lyman Moody. But this isn't just his story. This is a mirror, a question, a challenge to every person who has ever wondered, can God use someone like me? Because here's what I want you to consider as we journey together. If God could take a barely educated shoe salesman and use him to ignite revival fires across 2 continents, what might he do with your surrendered life? But let's begin at the beginning, where every great story of God's grace starts, with the breaking. It was February of 1841, on a bitter winter morning in Northfield, Massachusetts. 4-year-old Dwight Moody was about to watch his world collapse. His father Edwin, a brick mason and small farmer, lay motionless on the kitchen floor. Heart attack. No warning. No goodbye. Edwin left behind not just 9 children, but crushing debt. And his wife Betsy was pregnant with twins who would be born just 1 month after his death. Then, within just days of the funeral, creditors swarmed the Moody farm like vultures. They took everything, furniture, livestock, even the firewood in the dead of winter. The widow's survival strategy scattered the family. 4 older boys were sent to work neighboring farms. Some children were sent away for room and board. Dwight himself endured meals of cornmeal porridge and milk 3 times a day at one placement until his mother discovered his treatment and brought him home. But here's the first thing I want you to see. God's greatest servants often emerge from life's deepest breaking. When you've lost everything, you discover what and who truly matters. Maybe you know that feeling. Maybe you've stood in the rubble of broken dreams, wondering if God sees you. Hold that thought, because Dwight's story, your story, is just beginning. Fast forward 13 years later, and we find young Dwight still carrying the scars of that poverty. In the spring of 1854, 17-year-old Dwight arrived in Boston with one burning goal: escape the crushing poverty of his childhood. His uncle gave him a job in a shoe store, but with one non-negotiable condition: attend church every Sunday. And so, Sunday after Sunday, in that Mount Vernon Congregational Church, a quiet Sunday school teacher named Edward Kimball began to notice the restless young man. For weeks, Kimball wrestled with a burden he couldn't shake.
I must speak to Dwight about his soul.
Now, here's what moves me about this pivotal moment. Kimball wasn't a famous preacher. He had no seminary degree. He was just an ordinary man who said yes to God's prompting. On April 21st, 1855, Kimball finally found the courage. He later wrote about his approach to the shoe store. When I was nearly there, I began to wonder whether I ought to go in just then during business hours. I thought my call might embarrass the boy, but he kept walking. Finding Dwight in the back part of the building wrapping up shoes, Kimball placed his hand on the young man's shoulder and made what he later called a very weak plea. He said simply,
I told him of Christ's love for him and the love Christ wanted in return. That was all there was of it.
Right there in that dusty stockroom surrounded by leather and laces, Dwight Lyman Moody surrendered his heart to Christ. He would later recall,
I had not felt I had a soul till then, and I can feel the power of that man's hand on my shoulder tonight.
The next morning brought visible transformation. I thought the old sun shone a good deal brighter than it ever had before, Moody remembered. As I walked out upon Boston Common and heard the birds singing in the trees, I thought they were all singing a song to me. It seemed to me that I was in love with all creation. But conversion was just the beginning. The next chapter of Dwight's story would unfold not in peaceful New England, but in the rough and tumble frontier city of Chicago. By September of 1856, 19-year-old Moody had relocated to Chicago with one burning ambition: make $100,000 and become somebody. He sold shoes by day, climbed the ladder of success, and was well on his way to achieving his American dream. But gradually, God began redirecting his steps. Moody started visiting the slums, gathering street children for Sunday school. Dirty kids, rough kids, kids nobody else wanted. And remarkably, within just 1 year, over 1,500 children packed his makeshift classroom, the largest Sunday school in Chicago. The impact was so extraordinary that on November 25, 1860, President-elect Abraham Lincoln himself visited, telling the street children, "I was once as poor as any boy in this school, but I am now President of the United States, and if you attend to what is taught you here, some of you may yet be President of the United States." Revival didn't start with polished preaching. It started with simple love. One person seeing what others ignored. One heart breaking for what breaks God's heart. Who are the street children in your world? Who have others written off that God wants you to reach? For the next 15 years, Moody's ministry flourished. His influence grew, his reputation spread, but then came the night that would change everything. It was Sunday evening, October 8th, 1871. The Great Chicago Fire was about to begin, and in one catastrophic night, everything Moody had built would turn to ash. His church, his home, his life's work, all of it, gone. But as Moody walked through the smoldering ruins the next morning, something deeper than buildings had broken inside him. You see, that very Sunday night he had preached to a packed hall and told people to think about it and return next week to decide for Christ. Many never made it home. The fire consumed them along with the city. Standing in those ashes, Moody made a vow he would never break.
Never again will I give a gospel invitation without asking for an immediate response.
Sometimes God uses fire to refine us. Sometimes He allows everything we've built to crumble so He can build something eternal through us. Broken and seeking answers, Moody embarked on a journey that would transform not just his ministry, but his very soul. Just weeks after the devastating fire, Moody traveled to New York City, not for ministry, but for his own spiritual renewal. Two Chicago women, Mrs. Sarah Cook and Mrs. Hawkshurst, had been praying fervently for months that God would fill Moody with His Spirit. Day after day, he walked Wall Street like a man dying of thirst, crying out to God,
"Fill me with your Spirit. I don't want to preach in my own strength."
And then on one unforgettable day, while walking along Wall Street, it happened. Moody later wrote,
"I was crying all the time that God would fill me with His Spirit. Well, one day, in the city of New York, oh, what a day! I cannot describe it. I seldom refer to it. It is almost too sacred an experience to name. I can only say that God revealed Himself to me, and I had such an experience of His love that I had to ask Him to stay His hand."
From that moment forward, everything changed. As Moody later testified, the sermons weren't different, but hundreds were converted. The difference? The man preaching them was no longer running on empty. But God wasn't finished orchestrating divine appointments in Moody's life. The next encounter would forge a partnership that would change history. At a YMCA convention in Indianapolis in June of 1870, Moody encountered Ira Sankey, a government revenue officer from Pennsylvania with an exceptional singing voice. During a dragging prayer meeting, Sankey's rendition of "There is a fountain filled with blood" electrified the crowd. True to form, Moody's approach was typically direct.
"I've been looking for you for 8 years. I want you to come with me."
Sankey initially thought Moody was crazy, but sometimes the greatest movements begin with what the world calls crazy obedience. Together, they would become the most powerful evangelistic team of their generation. The formula was simple but supernatural. Sankey explained their synergy perfectly.
We are both preachers. The only difference is that Moody reaches men's hearts with words that are spoken, while I reach them with words that are sung. Hearts would melt, lives would change, revival would spread like wildfire.
And so, in 1873, this unlikely duo stepped out in faith toward what would become their greatest adventure. In June of 1873, Moody and Sankey set sail for England, not as famous evangelists, but as relatively unknown Americans answering an invitation from two men who had since died, a leap of faith that would require absolute trust in God's guidance. What followed over the next 2 years defied all human explanation. Starting in York, then moving through the great cities of Scotland and England, revival broke out wherever they went. Edinburgh saw 3,000 people added to city churches during their mission. Glasgow filled the 5,000-seat Crystal Palace nightly, culminating with over 7,000 new members joining Glasgow churches. But perhaps the most miraculous moment came on May 18th, 1874. While travelling by train from Glasgow to Edinburgh, Sankey discovered Elizabeth Clephane poem The 90 and 9 in a newspaper corner. The next evening, after Moody preached on The Good Shepherd, he requested an appropriate solo. Though Sankey had no written music, he felt compelled to sing. Note by note the tune was given, which has not been changed from that day to this. Moody, with tears, asked,
"Where did you get that hymn? I never heard the like of it in my life."
Providentially, Clephane's sister was in that night's audience. In London alone, they held 285 meetings across 4 major venues simultaneously, with 2,500,000 aggregate attendance over 4 months. Even Queen Victoria sent representatives. The British press dubbed it the Moody Wave. But here's what moves me most about this entire phenomenon. Moody never took credit. He understood the secret. "I am only the match," he would say. God provides the fire. What would happen if you stopped trying to be the fire and simply became the match? What if surrender, not skill, is what God is looking for? When Moody and Sankey returned to American shores in the summer of 1875, everything had changed. They were no longer unknown. Now, cities across America competed to host their campaigns. From Boston to Philadelphia, from New York to Chicago, wherever they went, revival followed in their wake. But by this point, Moody had learned something in Britain that changed his entire approach to ministry. Revival isn't about the evangelist. It's about the prayers of God's people and the power of His Spirit working through surrendered vessels. Before his ministry would end, an estimated 100 million people would hear the gospel through Moody's voice. But the numbers tell only part of the remarkable story. In city after city, bars would close, crime would drop, families would be restored, the spiritual temperature of entire communities would rise. This was revival. Not just emotional meetings, but genuinely transformed communities. But even at the height of his influence, Moody was already thinking beyond his own lifetime. He understood something profound about lasting impact. On January 22, 1886, recognizing that revival without training leads nowhere, Moody founded what would become the Moody Bible Institute. At the founding meeting in Farwell Hall, Moody declared,
"I believe we have got to have gap men to stand between the laity and the ministers, men who are trained to do city mission work. Take men that have the gifts and train them for the work of reaching the people."
The school offered no tuition barriers, no social prerequisites. The motto was beautifully simple: educate. Equipment, evangelize. Students came from farms and factories, from wealth and poverty, united by one passion: to serve Christ. But perhaps the most far-reaching impact came from the 1886 Mount Hermon Student Conference, where 100 students from 89 colleges pledged to become foreign missionaries. This birthed the student volunteer movement, which ultimately sent over 20,000 long-term missionaries from America over the next 40 years. From these halls would eventually come thousands of missionaries, pastors, evangelists, and Christian workers who would carry the flame to every continent on earth. Moody knew he wouldn't live forever, so he multiplied himself through others. How are you investing in the next generation? What eternal legacy are you building? And so, as 1899 drew to a close, we find our evangelist back where his story began, in the small town of Northfield, Massachusetts. His last campaign in Kansas City, Missouri, ended abruptly on November 16th, 1899, when he collapsed while preaching to 15,000 people at Convention Hall. Returning to Northfield, Massachusetts, he died surrounded by family on December 22nd, 1899, at noon, age 62. His final words were prophetic.
God is calling me.
When son William objected, Moody replied with absolute certainty,
No, I am at the gates. I have seen the children.
referring to deceased grandchildren.
This is my coronation day, and I have been looking forward to it for years.
Will thought his father might be dreaming, but Moody smiled with absolute certainty.
No, Will, this is no dream. I have been within the gates. I have seen the children.
And then with his final earthly breath came these unforgettable words.
This is my coronation day. I have been looking forward to it for years.
That was more than a century ago. But the fire that Dwight Moody carried, that flame still burns today. Dwight Lyman. Moody is gone, but the fire he carried still burns. Not in buildings or institutions, but in hearts surrendered to the same God who transformed a poor farm boy into a world changer. Here's what I want you to understand. Moody wasn't successful because he was naturally talented. He was successful because he was completely surrendered, utterly, without reservation. The world is still waiting for another Moody. Not someone to imitate him, but someone willing to follow his example of radical obedience to Christ. Maybe that someone is you. Maybe God has been preparing you through every disappointment, every broken dream, every moment of desperation for something you can't yet imagine. Moody once declared, "The world has yet to see what God can do with a person fully consecrated to Him. By God's help, I aim to be that person." So what if you said those same words today? What if you stopped making excuses and started making yourself available? What if right now, in this very moment, you decided to surrender everything to Jesus Christ? Because here's the truth Moody discovered and lived. You don't need to be famous to be faithful. You don't need credentials to be called. You don't need perfection to be powerful. You just need to be fully His. What will you do with this one life God has given you? The fire that changed the world still burns today. The only question remaining is this: will you carry it? Dwight Moody proved God uses surrendered vessels, not perfect ones. The barely educated shoe salesman who was rejected from church membership preached to over 100 million people because he stopped trying to be the fire and simply became the match. Comment with, "I am fully His" below if you are ready to surrender everything to Jesus Christ right now. Don't forget to hit that notification bell, like and subscribe to Cloud of Witnesses for more life-changing stories of faith that will equip you to boldly fulfill the call of God in your life. This week, write down 3 areas where you have been holding back from complete surrender to God. Each morning, pray specifically over one area and ask God to take full control. Journal what He shows you about letting go and trusting Him completely. But if Moody's surrender shocked you, meet Jonathan Edwards next. What if a chronically ill pastor's kid who battled depression and social awkwardness became America's greatest theologian? What if the same man who could barely function in social settings preached one sermon that literally caused people to grab church pillars, convinced they were sliding into hell? What 70 resolutions did he write at age 20 that shaped American Christianity for centuries? Could those same principles transform your life today? Check out this next video to discover how a socially awkward frontier pastor ignited the Great Awakening, the mystical encounters with divine beauty that fueled his ministry, and why complete consecration to God produces generational impact beyond your imagination.